I wish you were here. Where are you? Marin Ashby had been texting a dead woman for 11 months when a stranger finally texted back. She was sitting on the studio floor when it happened, her back against the cold kiln, a mug of tea going gray beside her knee. It was 11:52 on a Tuesday night. The studio was one long room above a shuttered bakery at the quiet end of Kestrel Bay, her workbench and wheel at one end, a narrow bed and a hot plate at the other. The whole of her life stacked into a space that smelled of clay and faintly, always of old bread. Outside, the bay was doing what it always did, after dark. Fog rolling up from the water, the foghorn calling twice and going quiet, the streetlights buzzing like something trapped. Marin had clay dried into the creases of her knuckles and a sister 11 months in the ground, and she typed the same 4 words she typed every Tuesday at midnight, the way other people lit candles or said prayers. I wish you were here. She never expected an answer. That was the point. The message was a small door she opened once a week into a room she knew was empty. Linnea's number still existed somewhere in the machinery of the world, and pressing send felt like pressing her palm flat against a window her sister stood behind. It hurt in a way Marin had come to need. Grief, she had learned, was not a wound that closed. It was a habit you kept feeding, because starving it felt like a second death. The phone lit up in her hand. Where are you? Marin stopped breathing. For a long moment, she simply stared at the gray bubble, certain her tired eyes had invented it. 11 months. 11 months of sending words into the dark and getting nothing back but the polite silence of a number that no longer belonged to anyone she loved. She had told herself more than once that the number had probably been reassigned. Some part of her had refused to believe it. Some part of her had needed to believe. Linnea's line still rang somewhere, unanswered, faithful. 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. This number is monitored, the stranger wrote. You've sent 43 messages to it since March. I want to know who you are and how you have it. 43. He had counted. Marin's thumb hovered over the screen. Every instinct told her to block the number, delete the thread, pretend the door had never opened. Instead, she read the words again, and a cold understanding settled over her like the fog off the bay. The person on the other end was not confused. He was not a customer service line or a teenager who'd inherited a recycled SIM. He spoke like a man reading a file. Wrong number, she typed, and then, because her hands were shaking and honesty was the only thing she had left at midnight, she added, I'm sorry. It used to be my sister's. She hit send before she could stop herself. Then she sat very still, as though the studio itself were listening. The reply came fast. Used to be, not a question. A blade turned to catch the light. He had heard the past tense and understood exactly what it meant, and instead of softening, he had pressed on it, the way you'd press a bruise to see how deep it went. Marin should have put the phone down. She was 29 years old, she worked nights, she had a shift at Halcyon House in 6 hours, and a boy named Wynne who was counting on her to show up Thursday, and she had absolutely no business trading words at midnight with a stranger who counted her messages. But there is a particular loneliness that only recognizes itself in another lonely thing, and something in the flat economy of his sentences had reached across the dark and taken hold of her. I text the number because I can't stand that it just stops. That the last thing on the other end is nothing. The dots came, went, came. So you talk to the dead, he wrote. So do you, she wrote back. If you kept a dead woman's number and never let it go, she didn't know why she wrote it. It was reckless. It assumed too much. But the silence that followed was not the silence of a man offended. It was the silence of a man who had been seen and did not like it, and could not look away. 40 minutes and a bay of fog away, in a house built into the cliffs above the water, Casimir Rook set the phone face down on his desk and did not touch it for a full minute. The room around him was quiet, in the particular way rooms became quiet when he was in them. Dark wood, a wall of windows holding back the night, a fire he never sat close enough to feel. 2 men stood near the door, one of them Bram, who had been with him 9 years and had learned the exact border past which questions were unwelcome. Neither of them spoke. They had watched their employer read a text message and go still, and they knew better than to ask what the stillness meant. The number had come to Casimir 11 months ago, scrubbed and clean, one of a dozen he cycled through. He had never wondered who'd had it before. Numbers were tools. You used them until they became dangerous, and then you burned them. This one had started lighting up in March, the same 4 words, once a week, always near midnight, from a number his people had flagged and traced within the hour. I wish you were here. He had assumed at first that it was a lure. A soft opening from someone patient enough to play a long game. In his life, tenderness was almost always a delivery mechanism for something sharper underneath. But 43 messages had come, and 43 had said nothing but grief. And tonight, for reasons he did not examine, he had answered. She died in March. He read it again. He thought of the trace his people had run months ago and filed away. The number's previous owner, a woman named Linnea Crane, deceased, survived by one younger sister. He had the sister's name in a folder somewhere. He had her address. He had, if he wanted it, the color of her front door. He had never once intended to use any of it. Bram shifted by the door. Sir, is it a problem? Dakti Azimir looked at the black glass of the window, at his own reflection laid over the drowned lights of the harbor. A woman he had never met was sitting somewhere in his city talking to a dead person on a line that ran, without her knowing it, straight into the center of the most dangerous man in Kestrel Bay. It was, by every rule he had ever lived by, a problem. Loose threads got people killed. You did not leave a stranger holding a door into your life. Send a car to her address. The one from the March trace, he said. 2 men. They don't approach, they don't knock, and they don't let her out of their sight. Just eyes. If anything moves toward that building, before I understand what she is, it goes through them first. Bram nodded and stepped out to make the call. Casimir turned the phone over again. The last message glowed up at him. If you kept a dead woman's number and never let it go, and something in his chest, a thing he'd assumed had calcified years ago, moved once, like a stone shifting underwater. He typed 3 words and deleted them. Typed them again. 20 minutes later, across the bay, Marin's phone lit the dim studio. She read the message, and the cold came back. Deeper this time, because now she understood that whoever this was, he could reach further than words. Don't be afraid, it read. But there's a gray car outside your building. It's mine. It won't come closer than the corner. Marin rose from the floor. She crossed to the window on legs. She didn't quite trust. She pushed back the curtain. Down at the corner, engine off, parked exactly where he'd said it would be, and sat a gray car with 2 shapes inside, waiting, patient, watching the light in her window. There are 2 kinds of people, Marin's sister used to say. The kind who run toward the thing that frightens them, and the kind who stand very still and hope it loses interest. Linnea had been a runner. Marin had spent 29 years being the other kind, and she was tired of it, in a way that had started to feel like fury, so she did not block the number. She did not call the police, who in Kestrel Bay were as likely to belong to the man in the gray car as to protect her from him. She stood at the window until her breath fogged the glass, and then she picked up the phone and typed the truest, most reckless thing she could think of. "If you wanted to hurt me, you wouldn't have warned me about the car." The reply took longer this time. "That's a dangerous assumption." "Maybe, but it's the one I'm making." She sat back down on the floor closer to the kiln, as if its dead warmth could steady her. "You could have said nothing. You could have just watched. You told me the car was there because some part of you didn't want me to be scared, so I'm choosing to believe that part." The dots appeared and stayed a long time. "You reason like someone who's been managed by frightening people before," he wrote. "You look for the crack of decency and you climb into it." It landed too close. Marin pressed her lips together. He was not wrong, and she hated that a stranger had read her posture from a distance the way you'd read a limp. She thought of Hollis, her sister's husband, her own brother-in-law, a soft-spoken man in good sweaters, who had spent 11 months explaining Marin's grief back to her, deciding what she could handle, managing her sorrow the way he managed his portfolio. She had climbed into his cracks of decency for years, mistaking control for care, until she couldn't tell the difference anymore. "You reason like someone who's frightened people on purpose," she wrote back, "and can't remember how to do it any other way." She braced for the line to go cold instead. Fair. One word. It undid something in her. Not because it was kind, it wasn't particularly, but because it was honest, and Marin had been drowning in a year of gentle dishonesty, of people telling her she was doing so well, of Hollis assuring her that Linnea would have wanted her to move on, as if he'd had a private line to the dead and Marin had only ever had a wrong number. They talked until 2 in the morning. Not about anything, and about everything. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. He didn't ask hers, though she understood by now that he already had it, and the strange courtesy of his not saying it aloud felt absurdly like respect. She told him she made pots, funeral urns mostly, lately, though she didn't say why. He told her he could not remember the last time he'd spoken to someone who wanted nothing from him. She said everyone wants something. He said not the way she meant it. She said what he meant. He didn't answer, and the silence was its own answer. At 2:11 she wrote, "The car's still there. It'll stay till morning," he wrote, "not to watch you. So nothing else does." She should have found it menacing. She found it, against all sense, like being tucked in. He did not sleep. Casimir rarely did. But tonight the sleeplessness had a different texture, less like vigilance, and more like a low current running under the skin. He stood at the window of his study as the fog thinned toward dawn, and thought about a woman who made urns and talked to a dead sister, and had looked at the most dangerous fact in her life, that a killer had her number and her address, and decided to bet on the sliver of him that was still human. It was the most foolish thing he'd ever seen anyone do. It was also, he was uneasily aware, the first time in years anyone had bet on that sliver at all. At 6, Bram returned with a folder Casimir hadn't asked for, and had known he would bring anyway, the full picture built overnight. Everything the March trace hadn't bothered to gather when the number was just a number. He set it on the desk and stood back. "Marin Ashby, 29, Bram said. "Ceramics sells at the Saturday market. Barely covers the kiln. Real money comes from nights at Halcyon House, the hospice on Warren Street." Sister was Linnea Crane, car accident, March. That's how the number came loose. The sister's husband, Bram, paused, the way he did when a detail had a hook in it. Hollis Crane? He's got money, and he's got reach. and about 4 months ago he petitioned the county for guardianship of a minor, boy named Wynne, 9 years old, aging out of the Warren Street group home. The sister used to mentor him. Now the aunt visits him twice a week, and the brother-in-law wants him. Casimir looked up. Why would a man like Hollis Crane want a boy from a group home? That, Bram said, is the interesting part. He doesn't visit the kid, not once. But he filed the day after. The boy's caseworker recommended Marin Ashby as a placement. Casimir turned this over slowly. He knew the shape of it because it was a shape he'd used himself. You don't fight the person directly. You take the thing they love and make it a lever. Hollis Crane didn't want the boy. He wanted the boy so that Marin would have to come to him, ask him, need him. So the woman who had finally started climbing out of the crack he'd kept her in would have a reason to climb back down. Keep the eyes on her, Casimir said. Add eyes on Crane. Bram nodded, and then, because 9 years bought a man 1 question a season, he asked it. Sir, what is she to us? Jack Casimir looked at the phone on the desk, dark now, holding a night's worth of the only honest conversation he'd had in longer than he could measure. I don't know yet, he said. It was the truest thing he'd said in years. Marin went to Halcyon House at 8 on no sleep, and clay still under her nails. She loved the hospice in a way she'd never loved anything with a paycheck attached, because it was the one place where her particular gift was not a liability. In the rest of her life, she was too much, too raw, too honest, a woman who cried at the wrong times and said the true thing at dinner parties. Here rawness was the job. Dying people had no patience left for the polite lie. They wanted someone who would sit in the dark of the thing with them and not flinch. She was refilling water cups when her phone buzzed. She'd told herself she wouldn't check it. She checked it. You didn't sleep either, he wrote. How do you know? You told me the car was still there at 2:11 in the morning, he wrote. People who sleep don't check the corner at 2 a.m. and then get up for an 8 o'clock shift. You never went to bed. Marin leaned against the medication cart and, for the first time in 11 months, felt caught in a way that didn't feel like a trap. She typed, "Who are you?" and looked at it and deleted it. Some doors you don't open until you're standing where you can survive what's on the other side. Instead, she wrote, I have to work. There's a woman here, Orla. 91. She's frightened, and I'm the only one she'll let near her. I have to go be brave for someone. The reply came as she was slipping the phone into her scrubs. Then be brave, he wrote. I'll be here when the dark comes back. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She walked down the corridor toward Orla's room, lighter than she'd walked in months, which was exactly why she didn't see, through the front glass of Halcyon House, the second car pull to the curb. Not the gray one, a black one. And the man who stepped out of it wore a good sweater and a soft, patient smile. And it was Hollis Crane. And he was walking up the path to the door. Orla Finch had been dying for 3 weeks and terrifying the staff for 2 of them. She was 91 pounds of fury and fear, a former lighthouse keeper's wife who had spent her marriage watching the sea take men and had decided at the end that she would not go quietly into any dark she hadn't chosen. She pulled out IV lines. She threw cups. She had made a nurse cry on Monday and refused a chaplain on Tuesday, and the day staff had started drawing straws for her room. The doctors called it agitation. Marin called it something else, because Marin had learned to look past the teeth of a frightened thing to the fear underneath, and Orla was not angry. Orla was a woman who had been in control her whole hard life and could feel the last of it running out between her fingers. Marin slipped into the room without knocking. Knocking asked permission, and then took it anyway. She'd stopped doing it years ago. She didn't cross to the bed. She sat in the chair by the window where Orla could see her and choose whether to acknowledge her, and she picked up the half-finished blanket someone had left on the sill and began, badly, to knit. "You're doing it wrong," Orla rasped after 4 minutes. "I know," Maren said. "I never learned. My sister tried to teach me and gave up. Give it here before you ruin it." Maren gave it here. Their fingers touched. Orla's cold and light as paper, and the old woman began to knit with hands that shook and did not stop. And Maren watched and said nothing, and let the silence be a place instead of a pressure. This was the whole of her gift, if it was a gift. She never reached straight for the wound. She did not walk into a frightened room and go hunting for the line, the chart, the fix. She sat down at the edge of the fear and waited until the fear got used to her, until it understood she wasn't there to trap it, until it could choose, on its own, to let her closer. "Everyone keeps trying to fix me," Orla said to the knitting. "Fix the line. Fix the pillow. Fix the—" her voice cracked. "There's no fixing it. I'm the thing that's broken, and it can't be mended, and they won't stop pretending." "I'm not going to fix you," Maren said quietly. "You don't fix what's breaking. You sit with it until it isn't afraid of you." Orla's hands went still on the needles. She looked up, and something in her ruined face eased, just slightly like a fist, opening one finger at a time. "Sit then," she said. Maren sat. Casimir Rook had come to Halcyon House to end a security problem. That was the reason he gave himself, standing in the corridor in a charcoal coat, while Bram waited by the doors, and the day nurse tried to decide whether to be afraid of him. Overnight, a stranger had become, without his consent, a fixed point in his attention, and Casimir did not tolerate fixed points he could not measure. He had come to look at her once in daylight, in person, to reduce her from the thing she was becoming in his mind, back down to a face, a woman, a manageable fact. He'd expected to feel the click of a problem being solved. Instead, he stood at the cracked door of a dying woman's room and watched Maren Ashby knit badly and say nothing, and slowly, without touching the wound, coax a terrified old woman back from the edge of her own panic, and the click never came. Something else came instead. He recognized it and could not name it because he had no recent word for the sensation of watching someone be good at the one thing he had spent his whole life failing to do. He kept people in line through fear. This woman kept a frightened creature calm through the opposite of fear, and it worked better, and he could not stop watching her do it. "You don't fix what's breaking," he heard her say through the gap in the door. "You sit with it until it isn't afraid of you." The words went into him like a key, into a lock. He hadn't known was there he should have left. He'd seen what he came to see, and more. But he stayed, one shoulder against the cold wall, and he did the thing he never did in front of his men or anyone else, for one unguarded moment, watching a stranger hold the dark for a dying woman. Casimir Rook let his face be a real face. The stillness in it cracked. Something almost like grief moved across it, and something almost like hope. And Bram, glancing over from the doors, looked quickly away, the way a man looks away from something he was never meant to see. Then a voice at the front desk said, "I'm looking for Maren Ashby. I'm family," in a tone as soft and reasonable as a hand closing over a wrist. And everything in Casimir went cold and quiet and precise. He knew the voice from Bram's file. "Hollis Crane here." On the same morning, which meant the man had eyes on Maren too, and had chosen this exact hour to remind her, in the one place she felt safe, that he could reach her there. Marin came out of Orla's room and saw Hollis by the desk, and went the specific gray of someone whose safe place has just been entered without permission. He turned toward her with his soft, patient smile, the one he'd worn at the funeral, and every careful visit since, and spread his hands as if he were the one owed an apology. "Marin," Hollis said warmly. "I didn't want to do this over the phone. It's about Win. The county's asked me to make some decisions about his placement, and I think we both know you're." The smile deepened, gentle as a blade going in slow, not really in a position to take on a child, not with the Knights, not with everything you're still working through. I only want what Linnea would have wanted. There it was. Linnea's name in his mouth, used like a key, turned to lock a door on her. Marin felt the old response rise in her body before she could stop it. The flush, the cold hands, the reflex to apologize for existing too loudly in a room. For one terrible second, she was back at her sister's funeral, holding a paper cup that Hollis had taken gently from her shaking fingers, while he told the mourners she was overwhelmed, poor thing, and she had let him, because it was easier than being seen to break. And then, past Hollis, she saw the tall stranger in the charcoal coat. She had never met him. She knew him instantly. Some animal part of her recognized the presence, the same steadiness that had sat at the corner in a gray car all night, so that nothing else could reach her, and it was standing against the wall of her safe place, with its eyes fixed on her, and it was not looking at her the way Hollis looked at her. Hollis looked at her like a problem he was patient enough to solve. The stranger looked at her like the one steady thing in a burning room. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She did not look at it. She would look at it later alone, in the dark, and find free words waiting there. I see him, and understand that the man from the midnight line had been watching the whole thing, had heard Hollis Crane weaponize her dead sister's name, and had already decided what it meant. Because Casimir was no longer only watching, he had pushed off the wall. He crossed the corridor toward Hollis Crane, with the unhurried, terrible calm of a man for whom violence had never once been an emergency, and he stopped just close enough that Hollis's smile faltered at the edges, and he said, in a voice pitched low enough that only the three of them could hear it, "You're standing in the one room in this city where people tell the truth, so let's try it. You don't want the boy, you want her to come asking." He tilted his head a fraction. "I'd think very carefully about the next thing you take from a woman who has already buried the only person she had left." The corridor had gone silent. The day nurse had stopped pretending to work. Hollis Crane looked at the stranger and did the calculation that everyone eventually did around Casimir Rook, the slow, dawning arithmetic of realizing the polite man in the expensive coat was something else entirely, and the color left his face. Marin stood frozen between the two of them, and understood. A beat too late, three things at once. The stranger from the midnight line was not merely dangerous in the abstract. He was the most dangerous kind of dangerous, the kind other dangerous men grew quiet around. He had just made himself an enemy of Hollis Crane on her behalf, without asking, Mole, and whatever door she had opened at midnight on the studio floor. Texting 4 words to a dead woman, it had not led to an empty room after all. It had led here, to a man walking into her real life and reshaping it with a sentence. And she did not yet know whether to be terrified, or for the first time, in 11 months, less alone. Hollis Crane did not raise his voice. Men like Hollis never had to. He simply gathered his soft smile back onto his face like a man picking up a dropped glove, said, "We'll talk when you're calmer, Marin," as if she were the one who had come uninvited into someone's sanctuary and walked back out into the gray morning. But Marin saw the thing he tried to hide as he passed the stranger in the charcoal coat, a flinch, quick and involuntary. The flinch of a predator, discovering a larger animal in the room. Then he was gone, and the corridor of Halcyon House was too quiet, and Marin was alone with a man she had spoken to every night for a week, and never once seen. "You were him," she said. "It wasn't a question. I'm him. You have a name." "Casimir." He offered nothing after it. No surname, no title, no explanation. He didn't need to. She had felt the temperature of the room drop when he moved, had watched Hollis Crane do the math. She understood now that the gray car and the counted messages and the warning at the corner all belonged to a man whose kindness was a room inside a fortress, and that she had been standing in that room for a week, without knowing the walls were there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a strange thing, Marin thought, to meet in the flesh someone whose voice you already knew in the dark. She had built him over 7 nights, out of the shape of his sentences, the economy of them, the way he pressed on a bruise, and then unaccountably bandaged it. She had expected the man to be smaller than the words. He was not. He filled the doorway the way the words filled a screen at midnight, completely, without ever raising his voice. "You came to see if I was a threat," she said. "Yes. And you're the most dangerous person I've met in 9 years." He said it without a trace of humor. "You made me answer a message I should have burned. You made me warn you about my own men. You made me stand here and watch you do a thing I've never learned how to do." His eyes moved once, briefly, toward Orla's door, then back, a threat. "To me, specifically, you threatened him," she said. "For me, without asking, I told him the truth in a place where truth is cheap." Casimir studied her. "You're angry." Marin stopped. She was angry, and under the anger was something more dangerous, a warmth she didn't trust, and under that was the plain animal fact that for the first time since the funeral, someone had stood between her and Hollis instead of standing beside Hollis explaining her. "You don't get to fight my battles by walking into them," she said finally. "That's not protection. That's just a different set of hands deciding what happens to me." Something moved behind his eyes. She'd surprised him. She could see that surprising him was not a common event. "Tell me about the boy," he said instead of arguing. So she did, there in the corridor, with Orla sleeping down the hall, and the day nurse pretending not to listen. 9 years old, at the Warren Street Group home. The boy Linnea had mentored for 2 years before the accident, reading to him on Thursdays, teaching him to throw clay on Marin's spare wheel, promising him a room and a real bed and a life. Linnea had started the guardianship paperwork the month before she died. Marin had taken it up after, because it was the last thing her sister had wanted, and because the boy had looked at her at the funeral with Linnea's own stubborn hope in his face, and she could not be one more adult who left. "And Crane filed against you," Casimir said. Not a question either. He already knew. He had known before she said a word, and she understood that too, that the man in front of her had a folder somewhere with her whole life pressed flat inside it, and that the only reason it didn't frighten her more was that he kept telling her it was there. "He doesn't even visit Wynne," Marin said. "Not once in 4 months. He filed the day after the caseworker put my name forward as a placement. That's the whole of it. He can't stand that I'm building something without him standing in the middle of it. If he has the boy, then I have to come to him, ask him, thank him, sit in his good living room and be told how much better he is at this than I am." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. "It's what he does. He makes himself the door you have to walk through to reach anything you love. Then he decides whether the door opens. And you'd rather lose the boy than walk through the door." "I'd rather find another way in," she said. "There's always another way in. He just makes you forget that. That's the trick of him." Casimir was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, quieter, and somehow older. "Let me handle Crane." "No, I can make the petition disappear by Friday." "No." She said it hard enough that the nurse looked up. "You just told me the truth is cheap here, so here's some. If you make my problems vanish with a phone call, you become the door. Then I'm not free of Hollis. I've just traded him for someone worse." She met his eyes. "Don't do a single thing about Wynne that I don't ask you to do. Promise me that." She had no leverage to demand a promise from a man like Casimir Rook. She knew it. She demanded it anyway. And Casimir Rook, who had not made a promise to anyone in longer than he could remember, looked at this woman with clay under her nails and grief in her spine, and said, all right, he kept it too, in the letter, if not the spirit. He did not touch the petition. But 3 days later, when Marin arrived at Warren Street for her Thursday visit, the harried caseworker who had never once returned her calls, a kind, overworked woman named Delia, met her at the door looking dazed and told her that Wynne's file had been reassigned to a senior advocate. That the expedited timeline Hollis's lawyers had been pushing had quietly evaporated, and that someone, Delia didn't know who, had made an anonymous endowment to the home that meant, for the first time in years, no child there would age out onto the street. Marin stood in the doorway and knew exactly who. He hadn't touched the petition. He had reached around it and rebuilt the whole board underneath it. It was help, and it was overwhelming, and it was, she made herself name it, standing there not asked for, the exact thing she'd told him not to do, done in a way that technically obeyed her and completely ignored her. That night she texted him, "You promised." "I promised not to make Crane disappear," he wrote back. "I gave money to children. Arrest me." "You know what you did." A long pause. Then, "Yes. I heard you and I did it anyway, because I couldn't stand still. I don't know how to do the other thing." "The other thing has a name," Marin wrote. "It's called asking." She didn't get her reply that night. But at dawn, when she climbed the stairs to her studio to start the day's work, she found the door already unlocked, and Casimir Rook sitting on the floor beside her cold kiln, in a coat that cost more than her car, holding 2 cups of coffee, waiting to be told whether he was allowed to stay. Here is how a fortress learns to knock. At first he came only at the edges. He learned that she worked nights at Halcyon House and slept in the mornings and threw clay in the long amber afternoons, and he began appearing in the afternoons, always with coffee, always sitting on the floor, always leaving the moment she said she was tired. He did not fill her studio with his presence the way other powerful men filled rooms. He made himself small in it, folded his dangerous shoulders down against the wall, and watched her work with an attention so complete it should have unnerved her, and instead began, day by day, to feel like being warmed. She set the terms out loud, one at a time, and made him repeat them back. "You don't send men to watch me without telling me they're there. I don't send men to watch you without telling you. You don't buy things to fix my life. If I need a thing, I'll earn it or ask for it." His jaw tightened at that one. "The kiln is 30 years old. It fires unevenly. Half your urns crack. Then half my urns crack." She held his gaze. "Say it." "I don't buy things to fix your life," he said, and looked as though the words caused him physical discomfort, and she almost laughed. He tested the lines the way water tests a wall patiently, looking for the gap. Nat. A crate of studio-grade glazes appeared. Addressed to Halcyon House as a donation, she sent it back. The best family advocate in 3 counties called her office to say his considerable fees had been taken care of by a well-wisher. She thanked him, declined him, and found instead a tired public interest attorney named Priya Sahota, who charged what Marin could actually pay and returned her calls at 10 at night from her kitchen table. A repairman arrived at the studio, unbidden, to service the kiln under warranty, a kiln that had never had a warranty in its life. Marin gave him tea and sent him away. Jasimir watched each gift come back and said nothing, but she could see something in him recalibrating, a man rewriting, line by line, an operating system he'd run without question for 25 years. He was not used to a no that held. In his world, a no was a price that hadn't been met yet. Marin's no wasn't a price. It was a wall, and he kept walking into it, and slowly, she watched it happen. He began to understand that the wall was the point, that she was showing him where she ended, and he began, and that most people in his life had never had an edge he wasn't allowed to cross. Why, he asked her one afternoon, genuinely baffled. I have more money than 3 lifetimes could spend. It costs me nothing to make your road easier. Why do you fight me on every stone of it? Because Hollis made my road easier too, Marin said. She was centering a lump of clay on the wheel, her hands wet, her voice level. For 14 years he made everything easier. He handled the money and the calls and the hard conversations and the grief, and every easy thing he handed me came with an invisible string, and by the end I couldn't lift my own arm without checking whether he'd let me. Easy is how they get you, Casimir. The ones who want to own you never start with a chain. They start with a favor. He was quiet for a long time. No one, he said finally, has ever explained to me why I was wrong in a way I believed. They built rituals without naming them. She started leaving the studio door unlocked in the afternoons. He started bringing 2 coffees without being asked, and eventually, a 3rd thing, small, wrapped in paper, that was never a gift because it was always something he'd made or found rather than bought. A smooth stone from the seawall, a sketch of her hands at the wheel drawn badly on the back of a receipt, once a single fig from a tree he passed. Things that cost nothing and meant everything, because they proved he had been thinking of her when she wasn't in the room. She learned him, too. That he removed his watch before he sat on her floor, as if the man who wore it and the man on the floor were different people. That he slept almost never and read every message from her twice. That he disliked being thanked and flinched minutely whenever she moved too fast near him, the flinch of a man whose body still expected the world to swing. And she learned about Win because she brought Win to the studio on a Thursday, and Casimir was there, and the boy, small, watchful, armored the way children in group homes learn to armor themselves, took one look at the dangerous man on the floor and said, "You sit like you're waiting to get told off." Daxmir looked at the boy who had named the exact truth of him in 9 words. "I usually am," he said. Wynne considered this with the grave thoroughness of a child who has learned that adults are weather, and you study weather to survive it. Then he sat down on the floor next to Casimir in the exact same posture, knees up, back to the wall, hands loose and ready. 2 exiles from the same country, waiting for a punishment that might or might not come. And he began to tell the most dangerous man in Kestrel Bay, at length, and without being asked, about the correct way to keep a clay pot from exploding in the kiln. "You can't rush the water out," Wynne explained. "If there's water still in it, and you fire it too fast, the steam's got nowhere to go, and it." He made a small, satisfying explosion with his hands. "Bang! You have to let it dry all the way first, slow. Boring." He shrugged. "Linnea taught me. She said most things break because somebody was in a hurry." Casimir was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was right about a lot of things. Wad?" She was right about everything, Wynne said, with the flat loyalty of the bereaved, and went back to explaining kiln temperatures. Maren turned back to her wheel so neither of them would see her face. On the wheel, a lump of clay wobbled off center under her wet hands, and for once she let it, because if she tried to speak, she was going to come apart, and she had decided a long time ago that she would do her coming apart alone. That was the afternoon. She understood she was in trouble. Not the danger of him. She'd made her peace with that. The other trouble, the one where a man the whole city feared, sat on your floor, learning kiln temperatures from a 9-year-old, and you felt something in your chest unlock that you had welded shut at a funeral, and you knew, with the clean certainty of Clay Finding Center, that you were falling in love with him. That night, Hollis Crane called. Maren almost didn't answer. She answered. "I hear you've made a powerful friend," Hollis said, warm as ever. "I do hope you know what he is, Maren, because the county's about to. I'd hate for Wynne's case to turn on the company his aunt keeps." She told Casimir that night, on the studio floor, with the phone still warm in her hand. He didn't react the way she expected. No cold stillness, no promise of consequences. He just listened, and when she finished he said, "He's right, you know about what I am. If Crane puts my name near that hearing, I become the reason you lose the boy." He said it flatly, a man reading his own file. "I'm a liability to the one thing you're fighting for. You should send me away. It would be the smart thing." "Is that what you want?" "No," he said. "It's the first time in my life the smart thing and the thing I want have pointed in different directions." The fog pressed against the studio windows. Somewhere out on the bay the horn called twice and went silent. "Tell me about your sister," Casimir said. Not how she died, who she was. And Maren, who had spent 11 months being told about her own grief by other people, found she could not remember the last time someone had simply asked her to talk about Linnea as a person instead of a wound. She was loud, Maren said, and smiled before she could stop herself. So loud! She laughed like she was trying to be heard in the next town. She married Hollis at 22, and I never understood it. He was so quiet, so careful, and she was a bonfire. And I think that was the whole appeal for him. He liked warming his hands at her. He just didn't want her to burn where anyone else could see. The smile faded. He spent 14 years turning the flame down slowly. So slowly, you couldn't point to the day. And I helped him, Casimir. That's the part I can't. I helped him, because when he managed her, he managed me, too. And it felt like love. It felt like being taken care of by someone who knew better. What changed? She died, and he turned all of it on me. Maren's hands were flat on her knees. At the funeral I was holding a paper cup of coffee, and my hand was shaking, and he took it from me, gently, in front of everyone, and told the room I was overwhelmed, poor thing, and everyone nodded. And I let him. Because it was easier than being seen to break in public. She looked up. That's when I started texting her number that night. Because he'd taken even my grief and handed it back to me pre-approved, the correct size, and the only place I had left that he couldn't manage was 4 words sent into the dark where nobody could take them gently out of my hands. "I wish you were here," Casimir said quietly. "I wish you were here," Maren agreed. It was the one true thing I got to say without permission. And then, 11 months in, the dark said, "Where are you?" Her eyes were bright. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To send that into nothing, and have nothing answer. "Tell me why I kept the number," Casimir said. "Since we're trading. I grew up on Warren Street." He said the same home. 25 years before your boy." Marin went very still. "I wasn't anyone. Smaller than the others, and I stayed smaller because staying small kept you off the radar." His eyes were somewhere else now, somewhere a quarter century back. "There was a little one who came in when I was 13, 6 years old. Didn't talk the whole first month. The bigger kids called him Sparrow because he was all bones, and he'd flinch if you moved too fast." A ghost of something crossed his face. "He decided I was his. I don't know why. I hadn't earned it. I had nothing. I was nothing. I couldn't protect him from anything. But he'd follow me around and fall asleep against my side, and he loved me like it was the easiest thing in the world, before I was anyone, before there was a single thing to gain from it." "What happened to him?" Marin asked, though she already knew from his voice that it was the kind of thing that made a man build a fortress out of himself. "He got sick. The home didn't have the money or didn't spend it. I was 15. I begged people who don't listen to 15-year-olds from Warren Street." His hands were very still. By the time anyone listened, it was too late. "He died in a county ward with me holding his hand, and I decided that night that I would never again be too small to protect what was mine. That I would get so much power that no one could ever tell me later while someone I loved died now." He looked up at her. "I got the power. I got all of it, and I have never once used it to save anyone the way I couldn't save him. I've only used it to make sure I never felt that small again." The studio was silent. "Every one who has come near me since I built the wall," Casimir said, "met me after the power. They love it or they fear it, and, either way, they're talking to the wall. Will Buyer, I kept your sister's number because 43 times a stranger sent 4 words into the dark, expecting nothing back. I wish you were here. And it was the only voice in more years than I can count that wasn't reaching for the wall. It was reaching for a person I'd forgotten there was one behind it." Marin's eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. "That's why Win," she said softly. "It was never about me, or not only. You looked at that boy, and you saw Sparrow." "I looked at that boy," Casimir said, "and for the first time I had the power and the time, and a woman standing next to me telling me I wasn't allowed to use it without asking." A rough, disbelieving breath that was almost a laugh. "Do you know what that is to a man like me? To be told to wait, to ask? It's the hardest thing anyone has ever demanded of me. And it's the only thing anyone's asked me to do in 25 years. That felt like being handed back something I lost." She reached across the small space between them and took his hand, the first time she had touched him, and turned it over, and pressed her clay-stained palm flat against his, the way she'd once pressed her hand to the window of a number that led nowhere. Neither of them moved to close the last of the distance. The kiss was there, in the warm dark, as near as breath. And they let it stay there, unclaimed, because both of them had learned the hard way what it cost. When a person took the thing they wanted before it was freely given. "Not yet," Marin whispered. "No," he agreed. "Not until it's yours to give." She fell asleep against his shoulder on the studio floor, and Casimir did not sleep at all, because he was doing arithmetic in the dark, the arithmetic of Hollis Crane, and a hearing, and a name that could cost a boy his home. He was still doing it at dawn when Marin's phone lit up on the floorboards between them. She stirred. Read it. Went cold in a way he felt through his whole side before she said a word. It was from Hollis. It was a screenshot, a photograph of Marin and Casimir on the studio floor, taken through the window from the seawall hours ago. And beneath it, 5 words, soft and patient and utterly without mercy. "The judge will love this." Maren did not sleep that night, and neither did she panic. She lay on the studio floor with the screenshot burning on the phone beside her, and Casimir's slow breathing warm against her side, and she felt something in herself go quiet and hard, the way clay goes when you've worked the air out of it and it's finally ready for the wheel. Fear was Hollis's whole language. Fear was the leash he'd used for 14 years, and she was so tired of being led by it that the tiredness had curdled at last into resolve. He sent it to frighten me into coming to him, she told Casimir in the morning, over the third coffee. So I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to walk straight at him in daylight, in front of witnesses, and I'm going to say the true thing out loud, because the one thing men like Hollis cannot survive is being described accurately to their own faces, in a room they don't control. Gotchkinger looked at her the way a soldier looks at a weapon he didn't know existed. That's what I do, he said slowly. Except I use money and men. You do it with a sentence. You taught me the room, actually, Maren said. Halcyon House. Where the truth is cheap. I just decided to stop paying retail for it everywhere else. But resolve is a thing you have to keep re-earning, and the days before the meeting tested hers in smaller ways. Halcyon House had hired a new grief counselor that spring, a gentle, easy-smiling man named Theo Marsh, who was good with the families and better with Maren, who lingered at the medication cart, who brought her tea she hadn't asked for, who told her kindly and more than once that she carried too much alone. There was nothing wrong with Theo. That was almost the problem. He was the sort of soft, safe kindness a sensible woman was supposed to want, and Maren watched herself not want it, and understood something about the difference between a man who makes your road easier and a man who simply refuses to walk it for you. Doc Tegsamir met Theo exactly once when he came to walk Maren out after a night shift, and found the counselor helping her into her coat. He said nothing. He was perfectly dangerously polite. But in the car afterward, he was quiet, in a way that had a texture to it, and Maren, who had spent her life managing men's moods, found she could not resist. "You're jealous," she said. "I don't get jealous. You've said 4 words in 10 minutes, and 2 of them were that man." Casimir stared out at the fog. "He offered to carry your bag. He did carry my bag. I'm aware." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I could carry the whole building." "I know," Maren said gently. "That's exactly why I'd rather carry my own bag." And she watched the words land, and watched him, slowly, unwillingly, begin to smile, because he was, against every instinct, learning to hear the love inside a refusal. He makes it look effortless. Being the safe one, the easy one. I have never once in my life been the easy one. No, Maren agreed. You're the one who sits on my floor learning how to ask. That's not easy. Easy would have been letting Hollis keep me. Easy is a cage with good manners. She took his hand. I don't want the man who makes it look effortless. I want the one it costs something. The chance to prove it came 4 days later at the County Family Services office, where Hollis had requested a voluntary conciliation meeting, a warm phrase for an ambush, a room with a mediator, and Hollis's 2 lawyers and a folder Maren already knew contained a photograph. Priya Sahoda came with her, in a suit that had seen better decades, carrying nothing but a legal pad and a calm that cost Hollis's lawyers their footing within the first 5 minutes. Hollis slid the folder across the table with his gentlest smile. I don't want to do this, Maren, but the court has to know the environment. This man, a photograph of Casimir, of the studio floor, is not a suitable influence for a child. Maren looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Hollis, and she did the thing she had learned to do at the bedsides of the dying. Long before she ever needed it for herself, she refused to flinch from the frightening thing, and she named it. "You didn't take this photograph, Hollis," she said quietly. "You paid someone to stand on a public seawall at night and photograph a private citizen through her own window. You've had me followed. For weeks. You've been surveilling a grieving woman and a 9-year-old orphan so that you could win an argument you started, for no reason, except that I stopped needing you." She turned to the mediator, whose pen had gone still. "I'd like that on the record, not the photo, the camera behind it." The room changed temperature. Priya, without a flicker, laid a single sheet on the table. A preservation of evidence request, drafted the night before, naming the surveillance. Hollis's lawyers exchanged the specific glance of men recalculating a fee. "That's a serious accusation," Hollis said, and for the first time in 14 years, Marin heard the thing under his voice that his softness had always hidden. Not calm. Control that had just felt the floor tilt. "No," Marin said. "It's a serious fact. You've spent your whole life making other people's truth sound like their hysteria. It doesn't work on me anymore. I sat with a woman last week while she died, Hollis. After that, you're just a man in a good sweater who's afraid of a room he can't run." She stood. "We're done here. My lawyer will handle the rest of your ambushes by mail." She walked out on legs that did not shake, and did not look back, and did not see Hollis Crane's face, but Priya did, and Priya said, in the elevator, in a tone of professional wonder, "I have never once watched a client win a meeting by leaving it." That should have been the victory. It was for about 6 hours. Because that evening, when Marin climbed the studio stairs, there were flowers waiting outside her door. White lilies, funeral lilies, in a heavy glass vase. She hadn't ordered them. Casimir hadn't sent them. Casimir sent stones and figs and terrible sketches, never anything a florist touched. She opened the small card with a cold that had nothing to do with the fog. It was not signed. It said in a typed line, "Such a lovely little family you're building. Fragile things, families. A friend of Mr. Rook's." And underneath the vase, holding it down against the wind, was a second photograph. Not of Marin. Of Wynne, walking home from the group home, alone, taken from a car, close enough to count the freckles on the back of his neck. Don Casimir went very still when she showed him, and it was a different stillness than she had seen before, not the coiled quiet of a man deciding how much force to use, but something bleaker, a man recognizing a bill he'd always known would come due. "Shrike," he said. "Who is Shrike?" "A man who wants my stretch of the port and has spent 3 years failing to take it. He can't outfight me, so he's been looking for the softer road in." Dax Casimir set the photograph of Wynne down very gently, as though it were the boy himself. For 9 years there wasn't one. No wife, no family, nothing anyone could put a hand on. And then I answered a text at midnight. His jaw worked. "I did this. I put a target on a 9-year-old by letting myself sit on your floor. Then we take the target off." Marin said. "How?" "My way," Casimir said, and she heard the old machinery come online in his voice, the machinery that had gotten power so no one could ever tell him later again. "I put 50 men on the boy tonight. I move you both behind my walls where nothing gets in. I find Shrike and I make the cost of touching either of you so high that—" His phone rang. It was Delia, the caseworker, and her voice was coming apart. Wynne was gone. He'd overheard 2 staff members talking about the flowers, about a man watching him, about Marin, maybe not being safe to be around. and the boy who had already lost everyone had done the only thing his small history had taught him to do when adults started deciding his life in low voices. He'd climbed out a window into the fog and run. Casimir was already moving, already dialing, and already becoming the flood of men and cars and force that was the only love he'd ever known how to give. I'll have every street between here and the water covered in 20 minutes. Stop. Marin caught his wrist. He could have broken her grip without noticing. He didn't. He stopped. Listen to me, she said, and her voice was the one she used in the room. Nobody would enter, low and level and certain. If you flood the streets with 50 frightened men and headlights and shouting, what does a terrified child do? A child who ran because the adults got loud and started deciding things about him. Casimir stared at her. She watched the answer arrive in him like a wound. He goes deeper, he said. He hides, or he runs somewhere. No one would look. Toward the water, Marin said, where it's quiet, where nobody's shouting. She was already pulling on her coat. You cannot force a frightened thing into the light, Casimir. You've watched me now for weeks. You know this. You don't fix what's breaking, you sit with it until it isn't afraid of you. So we're going to do this my way, 2 of us. Quiet, no headlights, no men. And you are going to do the hardest thing I will ever ask you to do. She met his eyes. You're going to be powerless on purpose and trust that it works better. For one long moment, she watched 25 years of iron argue with her. Then, Casimir Rook, who owned a stretch of a city, who had never in his adult life walked toward danger without an army, put his phone in his pocket and picked up nothing and said, "Tell me where to walk." They found Wynne at the foot of the old lighthouse at the end of the seawall, folded into the gap between the rocks and the rail, soaked and shaking and trying very hard to be too small to see. Marin did not run to him. She sat down on the wet stone, 8 feet away, where he could watch her and decide, and she did not reach for him, and she did not fix him. She started talking about nothing, about how the left kiln always squealed in the last 10 minutes of a firing, about how the fog tasted like pennies, about how Linnea used to say most things broke because somebody was in a hurry. Wynne did not answer. He pressed himself deeper into the rocks. "You should go away," he said, in the flat, careful voice of a child who has learned that the safest thing to do with love is refuse it before it can leave on its own. Everybody who's near me gets. There was a man watching me. Because of me, they said you weren't safe because of me. His voice cracked. Linnea's dead because of a car, and now there's men in cars because of me. And if I'm not here, then nobody has to. Wynne Marin kept her voice level, though something in her chest tore clean across. "Do you know why I sit in the room nobody else will go in? At the hospice?" A small silence. "No." "Because everybody else walks in trying to fix the dying person. Make them calmer, make them quieter, and make them easier. And a dying person can feel that. They can feel you wanting them to be different than they are." She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I don't do that. I just sit down and let them be exactly as scared as they are, for as long as they need, and I don't leave. That's the whole secret. That's all I know how to do." She looked at him through the dark. "You don't fix what's breaking, Wynne. You sit with it until it isn't afraid of you. I'm not here to fix you or move you or decide anything about you. I'm just going to sit on this cold rock until you're not scared to come out, even if it takes all night. I've got nowhere else I'd rather be." "That's a stupid secret," Wynne whispered. "It's the only one that's ever worked." Casimir sat down beside her on the freezing rock in a coat worth more than the lighthouse, and made himself the smallest a large, dangerous man can make himself, and said nothing at all. It was, Marin knew, the loudest silence of his life. Every cell in him built to act, to command, to solve, holding perfectly still because she'd asked him to trust that stillness was the stronger thing. It took 20 minutes. It took saying nothing and needing nothing, and letting the frightened thing come to them. The fog thickened. The horn called twice, far out. Hey? Marin kept talking about the fig tree. Casimir passed on his walks, about the terrible sketch of her hands, about anything, a low, steady rope of ordinary words, thrown out into the dark for a drowning child to find. And when Wynne finally crossed the 8 feet of wet stone, he didn't come to Marin. He climbed into the narrow space between them, against Casimir's side, and pressed his cold face into the coat of the most feared man in Kestrel Bay. And Casimir, who had held a smaller boy's hand in a county ward 25 years ago and sworn he would never be that helpless again, put one careful arm around him. Being present were not, after all, the same thing. "I've got you," Casimir said very quietly, into the boy's wet hair, and Marin understood that he was saying it to Wynne, and to Sparrow, and to the 15-year-old he'd once been, all at once 25 years late, and exactly. Over the boy's head in the dark, Marin reached out and took his hand. "Who does this for you?" she asked him quietly. "When the quiet gets loud, when you've got words in you and nowhere to send them but into the dark." She already knew the answer. She'd lived his answer for 11 months. "Whoever once answered you back." Casimir looked at her, across the sleeping weight of the boy, and the fog, and everything the years had cost him. "No one," he said. "Until a wrong number." She closed the last of the distance then, not because the danger was gone, because it wasn't, but because she had finally decided the kiss was hers to give. It was slow and salt-cold and chosen, and when it ended, he pressed his forehead to hers and breathed like a man who had walked a very long way to a door he'd assumed was locked. Then his phone buzzed against her hip. Once, a text. He read it over her shoulder, and she felt every muscle in him turn to stone. It was from a number he didn't have to name. It said, "Good. Now I know all 3 faces. Here is the thing about a man who has spent his whole life learning only one way to keep the people he loves alive. When the fear comes back, so does the only tool he trusts." Marin woke the next morning in Casimir's fortress on the cliffs. She had not decided to be there. That was the whole horror of it. She remembered the drive from the seawall, Wynne asleep between them, the exhaustion pulling her under before they arrived, and she woke in an enormous quiet room, with the sea below the windows and her own clothes, somehow, already hanging in a closet. Her wheel and her tools sat arranged on a table by the window, packed and moved and unpacked while she slept. Wynne's small bag was in the next room. A guard stood at the end of the hall. When she tried the door to the terrace, it was locked, and a voice through an intercom she hadn't noticed said, gently, that Mr. Rook had asked that the doors stay secured for her safety. For her safety. She found Casimir in a war room 3 floors down, unshaven, surrounded by men and maps and screens, running on the same fuel he'd run on for 25 years. He looked up when she came in, and the relief on his face was real, and that was the worst part, that he thought he'd done something loving. "You moved me," Marin said very quietly. The men in the room found reasons to study the maps. "I secured you." He crossed to her. "Both of you. Shrike knows all 3 faces now. You, me, the boy. There is nowhere in this city I can keep you safe except behind these walls. So yes, I brought you here, And yes, I did it while you slept, because you needed to sleep, and there was no decision to make. There was no decision to make. She repeated it back to him, and watched him hear it. Do you know who says that sentence, Casimir? Do you know the exact man who taught me that sentence means I have decided, and your no is a formality. I'm too kind to make you say out loud. His face changed. This is not that. I am trying to keep you alive. 2 nights ago, Marin said, I stood on a seawall, and I told you that you cannot force a frightened thing into safety. That if you flood its world with your fear and your walls and your men, it doesn't feel protected, it feels trapped, and you believed me. You sat down on a cold rock and made yourself powerless because I asked you to, and it worked, and a child came out of the dark because for once nobody was deciding his life in a low voice. Her eyes were wet and furious. And then you carried me up here and did to me the exact thing I taught you not to do to him. You put me behind a wall while I slept and called it love. You decided my no didn't matter, because your fear was louder than my voice. Because if I lose you, then you'd have lost me, the way Hollis lost Linnea, Marin said slowly. By turning the flame down for my own good, until there was nothing left of me to lose. The room was silent. Bram, by the door, was looking very hard at the floor. I am not a frightened child you found at Warren Street, Marin said, softer now, which was worse. I am not Sparrow. You cannot save me by making me small enough to fit inside your walls. That's not the version of me you fell for. The version of me you fell for is the one who sends true things into the dark, whether or not it's safe. She reached into her pocket and set her studio key and the guest room key they'd given her on the map table between them. I'm leaving. I'm taking Wynne back to Delia, where the court can see he's with the person who doesn't cage him. You can't. He stopped himself. She watched him stop himself. She watched the sentence, the boy needs you. You can't take him into danger form and die behind his teeth because he knew, the instant he reached for it, that using Wynne as a leash would prove every word she'd said. A boy had once loved him without a single chain on it, before he was anyone, and he had sworn, holding that boy's hand at the end, that he would never turn love into the thing that traps. He was not going to break that vow now, with her, to keep her. I could stop you from leaving, he said instead, quietly. I have 50 men in this house. Yes, Marin said. You could. That's exactly the choice. That's the whole of it right there. Casimir Rook looked at the woman who had answered him from the dark, and at the keys on the table, and at the person he wanted to be standing just out of reach behind the person he had always been. And he made the hardest calculation of his life, the one where the smart thing and the thing he wanted and the thing that was right finally, agonizingly pointed the same way, straight at his own heart. One car, he said, and his voice was wrecked. One driver you choose, he leaves the second you're somewhere you feel safe. No one follows, no eyes. Every instinct in him was screaming, she could see it, he did it anyway. And I will handle Shrike so that this is over. Not to make you come back, because it should never have touched you at all. Marin picked up her studio key, left the other. At the door she stopped, without turning around. For what it's worth, she said, you just did the bravest thing I've ever seen you do. You let me go. Don't undo it by being at my door tomorrow. He wasn't at her door tomorrow. That was how she knew he'd finally understood her. And it was the loneliest she had felt since the last time a number failed to answer. He sent one message the morning after, and only one. I watched you refuse to cage a frightened child, and then I caged you, and told myself the fear made it different. It didn't. Your things are back in your studio, exactly as they were. I had them returned before you woke, so you'd never have to picture my hands on them. Anything of yours I ever touched is with Delia now, not me. I will not contact you again unless you ask. Whatever else I am not the door you have to walk through. Not to reach the boy, not to reach anything. Maren read it every night for a week. She told herself the silence was strength. And out in the fog, unanswered, a man who had traded honesty like currency his whole life kept the hardest promise he had ever made. He stayed away, and he said nothing, and he let his silence be the one gift she was free to refuse. To Casimir Rook ended Shrike the way Maren would have, which is to say, he ended him without a single shot, and it cost him almost everything, and he considered it a bargain. He did not flood the streets. He did the patient, boring, unglamorous thing, the thing you do when you finally understand that turning every problem into violence only proves the fear is still the one holding the leash. He gave Shrike the stretch of the port the man had wanted for 3 years, handed it over clean in a room full of witnesses who would carry the story. Rook went soft, Rook stepped back, and Rook is finished. He let them believe it. A man with nothing left to take is a man no one can reach through the people he loves. He traded the empire he'd built so that no one could ever be small again in order to make one woman and one boy not worth the price of a bullet. It was the first time in 25 years he had used his power to make someone safe the way he couldn't save Sparrow, by having less of it, on purpose. Then he went home to an empty house on the cliffs and did the only thing left that was his to do. He waited to be asked. Maren won win on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after she walked out of the house on the cliffs. Priya had turned Hollis's own camera against him. A judge takes a dim view of a man who surveils a grieving woman and an orphaned child to win an argument. And Hollis Crane's soft, careful, controlling world could not survive being described accurately in a room he did not run. He withdrew his petition. He kept his good sweaters and his good address, and lost, forever, the one thing he'd truly been fighting for, which was the belief that Maren still needed a door to walk through. She didn't. She hadn't for months. She signed the placement papers with clay under her nails, and Wynne moved into the little room at the quiet end of the studio, above the shuttered bakery, into a real bed with a real quilt, exactly as a loud woman had promised him before the road took her. That night, a Tuesday, of course it was a Tuesday, Maren sat on her studio floor at 11:52, with a mug of tea going gray beside her knee, and for the first time in almost a year, she did not text her sister. She didn't need to send the 4 words into the dark. She looked at the life around her, the boy asleep at the far end of the room, the kiln she'd finally saved enough to have serviced with her own money, the space on the floor where a dangerous man used to fold himself small and wait to be told he could stay. It wasn't a wound she had to keep feeding anymore. It was just a place where love had been, and still was, wearing new faces. Her phone lit up in her hand. She hadn't texted anyone. But the screen glowed, and the message was from a number she had every reason to know by heart, the number that had once belonged to her sister, and now belonged to the only man who had ever answered her back. And it said, and she had to read it 3 times, because the world had turned all the way around and handed her own ghost back to her transformed. I wish you were here. 4 words. His, this time. Sent into his own dark, expecting nothing, the way she had sent them for 11 months. An offering with no leash on it. A door left open that she was free to walk past. Maren's hands did not shake. She typed 2 words, and her whole heart was in them, And they were the same 2 words. A frightened, dangerous man had once fired back at a stranger who knew too much, except that everything underneath them had inverted, fear into faith, interrogation into invitation, a demand to know into a longing to close the distance. "Where are you?" The reply came fast, the way his replies always came when they mattered, outside. "At the bottom of the stairs. I haven't come up. I won't. Unless." She was already moving. He was standing at the foot of the studio stairs in the fog, hatless, the sea behind him, a man who had given away a city and kept nothing but the willingness to wait at a threshold. He had no flowers, no folder, no men, and no plan. He had a stone from the sea wall in one hand, smooth and gray and worthless and chosen, and he held it out to her the way another man might have held out the world. "I gave Shrike the port," he said. "I gave the court nothing to fear. I gave back everything of yours I ever held." His voice was rough. "I don't have very much left to offer you. That isn't just me. Standing here, learning how to ask. So, I'm asking." He looked up the stairs, at the warm light, at her. "May I come up? And if the answer is no, I'll put this stone on your step and go, and it will still have been worth a whole life spent getting it wrong, to have finally learned how to let someone say it." Marin looked at him. The most feared man in Kestrel Bay, made small on purpose at the bottom of her stairs, holding a rock, waiting for a word he could not command. "You know the terms," she said, and her voice only shook a little, and this time the shaking wasn't fear, it was the other thing. The thing that comes after. You decide you're allowed to have what you want. You don't decide my life while I sleep. You knock even when the door's open. You ask even when it's slower, and when I say no, the no is real." "The no is real," he said. "I know that now. It's the most important thing anyone ever taught me." "Then yes," Marin said. "Come up." He wiped his shoes on the mat without being asked. He climbed the crooked stairs into the warm and the light, into a small life with a serviced kiln, and a sleeping boy, and a jar on the shelf that used to hold her grief, and now held nothing but bay glass and buttons, because she didn't need a place to keep the ache anymore. He set the stone on the windowsill beside all the others he'd brought, a small gray record of every day he'd thought of her when she wasn't in the room. There had been no dog here to force the ending, no creature that refused to leave after a single kindness, only a boy who'd run toward the water and come back, and a man who'd owned a city and traded it away, and a woman who'd sent 4 words into the dark for 11 months, and on the far side of all that grief, finally gotten an answer that stayed. "I love you," Casimir said. He said it plainly, without leverage, a man who had unlearned how to make love sound like a transaction. "Not the wall. You get the person. I don't know how much of him is left, but every part that is yours, and only for as long as you keep saying, 'Yes, I love you too,'" Marin said. "I'm not certain it'll be easy. I've never wanted easy," he said. "Easy is how they get you. Someone taught me that." She laughed. The sound filled the small studio the way it used to fill Halcyon House, the way Linnea's laugh used to try to reach the next town, and she crossed the last of the distance, and this time no one waited at any threshold because she had invited him all the way in. Outside, the foghorn called twice and went quiet. At the far end of the room, a boy slept in a real bed. And, in a small studio above a shuttered bakery in Kestrel Bay, the most dangerous man in the city set down the last of his power like a coat by the door, and stayed, not because he'd taken a single thing, but because, for the first time in his life, he had been asked. He had sent 4 words into the dark, and the dark, at last, had answered back. Stay.